Every dollar you saved, every paycheck you earned, every year you worked, there is a number, a threshold, where saving becomes pointless, where working becomes futile. America crossed that line, and no one told you. I used to believe inflation was something that happened elsewhere. Unstable economies, failing states, places without the institutions we built over centuries. I trusted that belief for most of my adult life. I was wrong about it. The machinery of monetary destruction does not care about borders or constitutions. It follows debt, and America now holds more debt than any nation in recorded history. Between January 2021 and late 2024, consumer prices rose by approximately 20%. That is not a number from a textbook. That is not an abstraction for someone else to worry about. That is 1/5 of everything you earned, 1/5 of everything you saved, transferred out of your account without a single notification. The Federal Reserve called this transitory. They used that word for nearly 2 years. Then they stopped. But by then, the extraction had already occurred. The damage was not pending. It was complete. When was the last time your savings account paid you more than inflation took? I want you to actually think about that question, not as rhetoric, as a calculation, because the math does not lie and cannot be argued with. If your savings account yields 4% and inflation runs at 6%, you are not building wealth. You are watching it evaporate, slowly enough that you do not feel it day to day, consistently enough that it compounds into something you cannot ignore. The gap between what you earn on savings and what inflation removes is not an accident. It is a spread, and someone is capturing that spread. I will tell you who. Here is how the extraction mechanism actually works. When the government spends more than it collects in taxes, it borrows the difference by issuing treasury bonds. Someone has to buy those bonds. When the Federal Reserve steps in as the buyer, it does not use money that already exists. It creates new dollars out of nothing. Those new dollars enter the system and chase the same goods and services. Prices rise. Your purchasing power falls. This is not a side effect of policy mistakes. This is the mechanism working exactly as designed. If your purchasing power drops 20%, but your salary stays flat, did you get a 20% pay cut without anyone signing a paper? The Federal Reserve responded to inflation with the fastest interest rate increases since the early 1980s. Rates went from near zero to over 5% in roughly 18 months. The stated goal was to crush demand, make borrowing expensive, slow the economy. It worked partially. Headline inflation slowed. But here is what I noticed that most people did not. Prices never came back down. They never do. Inflation is not a wave that rises and recedes. It is a ratchet. Each notch locks in place. The 20% you lost is not coming back. It belongs to someone else now. The Bureau of Labor Statistics measures inflation using the Consumer Price Index. But the methodology has changed significantly over the decades. If we measured inflation today using the same formula from 1980, the numbers would look very different, more alarming. The metrics were adjusted. The basket of goods was modified. Substitution effects and hedonic adjustments were introduced. I am not claiming conspiracy. I am stating observable fact. The number you see on the news is a product of methodological choices. Those choices were made by the same institutions that benefit when reported inflation appears lower than reality. How many hours of your labor have been erased in the past 3 years alone? I started calculating this for myself, not for some hypothetical average worker, for my actual income, my actual savings, my actual purchasing power loss. The result made me physically uncomfortable. I realized I had been working harder, earning more on paper, and falling behind in reality. The treadmill was accelerating beneath my feet. The incline was increasing, and I had not noticed because the changes came gradually. Each month felt normal. The cumulative effect was devastating. The Federal Reserve is now structurally trapped. This is not opinion. This is mechanics. If it raises rates high enough to truly kill inflation, it triggers a cascade of failures. Banks holding long-duration bonds collapse the way Silicon Valley Bank did in 2023. The housing market freezes. Corporate debt defaults spike. The economy craters. But if it lowers rates to prevent that collapse, inflation reignites. Borrowing becomes cheap again. Asset prices inflate again. The cycle accelerates. There is no door-marked exit. There is only the choice of which type of damage to accept next. This is where I had to abandon everything I thought I understood. Inflation is not a policy failure. If it were a failure, it would have been corrected by now. The tools exist. The knowledge exists. Central bankers study these patterns for their entire careers. The historical parallels are documented in detail. And yet here we are, which means something else is true. Something I was not ready to accept until I followed the money, until I asked who benefits when your dollars lose value. Inflation is not an accident. It is a tool, and I am not the one holding it. The answer to that question changed how I see everything. Who benefits when your dollars lose value? It sounds like the setup for a conspiracy theory, but the answer is not hidden. It is not classified. It sits in plain view on the Treasury Department's own website. The United States government currently holds over $36 trillion in debt. That number grows by roughly $1 trillion every 100 days. And here is the part they never explain on the evening news. Inflation makes that debt easier to repay. This is not theory. This is arithmetic. If you borrow money today and inflation rises tomorrow, you repay that loan with dollars that are worth less than the dollars you borrowed. The debt stays the same on paper, but its real burden shrinks. For ordinary people with fixed-rate mortgages, this can be a small benefit. For a government holding $36 trillion in obligations, it is the only survivable path. Raising taxes high enough to service that debt would trigger political annihilation. Cutting spending would require dismantling programs that millions depend on. Neither option is structurally viable. Inflation is the only door that remains unlocked. If your savings account pays 4%, but inflation runs at 6%, are you saving money or losing it more slowly? Economists have a term for this. They call it financial repression. The phrase sounds technical, almost neutral, but what it describes is wealth extraction by design. Financial repression occurs when the government holds interest rates below the rate of inflation. This means savers receive nominal returns that appear positive. Your statement shows a gain, but adjusted for purchasing power, you are losing ground every single year. The gap between what you earn and what inflation takes is transferred directly to debtors, and the largest debtor in America is America itself. This is not a new invention. The United States used this exact strategy after World War II. In 1945, the debt-to-GDP ratio peaked at approximately 120%. The government owed more than the entire economy produced in a year. Raising taxes to pay it off was not politically feasible. A war-weary population would not accept that burden. So instead, policymakers held interest rates artificially low while allowing moderate inflation to persist. Over the next 35 years, the real value of that debt melted away. Savers funded the repayment without ever seeing a bill. They simply watched their purchasing power erode decade by decade. By 1980, the debt-to-GDP ratio had fallen below 35%. The debt did not disappear. It was transferred from the government's ledger to your grandparents' savings accounts. I found this history unsettling, not because it happened, but because it worked. The strategy achieved its objective. The debt became manageable. And almost no one understood they had paid for it. There were no protests in the streets about financial repression, no congressional hearings, no magazine covers. The extraction was invisible because it was gradual. This is the genius of inflation as a political tool. It takes without asking. It taxes without legislating. It redistributes without debate. When politicians promise to reduce the debt, do they ever mention that inflation is already doing it by taking from your pocket? On August 15, 1971, President Nixon made an announcement that changed the structure of global finance forever. He closed what was called the gold window. Before that date, foreign governments could exchange their dollars for gold at a fixed rate. This created a constraint on how many dollars the United States could print. After that date, the constraint vanished. The dollar became a pure fiat currency, backed by nothing except confidence in the issuing government. This unlocked capabilities that previous administrations never had: the ability to create money without limit, the ability to fund deficits without immediate consequence, the ability to export inflation to trading partners holding dollar reserves. For decades, this arrangement appeared to work. America ran trade deficits. Foreign nations accumulated dollars. Those dollars were recycled into treasury bonds. The United States received cheap goods and cheap credits simultaneously. Economists celebrated this as a privilege, the exorbitant privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency. But privileges have costs, and those costs were accumulating in ways that remained invisible until recently. The debt-to-GDP ratio has now exceeded 100% for the first time since World War II. We are back where we started. Except this time, there is no post-war boom coming, no demographic explosion, no industrial expansion to inflate our way out painlessly. The last time inflation threatened to spiral beyond control, the Federal Reserve had a weapon. His name was Paul Volcker. In the early 1980s, Volcker raised interest rates above 20%. He crushed inflation by inducing a brutal recession. Unemployment spiked. Businesses failed. The pain was real and widespread, but it worked. Inflation collapsed from double digits to manageable levels within a few years. Volcker is now remembered as the man who saved the dollar. What people forget is what made his intervention possible. In 1980, the debt-to-GDP ratio was under 35%. The government could afford high interest rates because its debt burden was low. Servicing that debt at 20% interest was painful but survivable. Today, the calculation is entirely different. With debt exceeding $36 trillion, every percentage point increase in interest rates adds hundreds of billions to annual interest payments. The government is already spending over $1 trillion per year just on interest, not on reducing the debt, not on funding programs, just on servicing what it already owes. If rates rose to Volcker-era levels, the interest expense would consume the entire federal budget. This is the trap I keep returning to. The Volcker option no longer exists. The one tool that definitively killed inflation in living memory has been mathematically eliminated. What happens to your retirement plan if this continues for another decade? I spent a long time hoping someone would find an exit, a policy innovation, a technological breakthrough, some mechanism that could resolve $36 trillion in obligations without extraction from ordinary savers. I read papers, I listened to economists, I studied historical parallels, and what I found was not reassuring. Every nation that reached this level of indebtedness relative to its economy followed one of three paths: default, hyperinflation, or slow, grinding financial repression over decades. America will not default. The political and economic consequences would be catastrophic beyond calculation. Hyperinflation remains unlikely in the short term because of the dollar's reserve status. That leaves the third path, the quiet one, the invisible one, the one already underway. This is not speculation about what might happen. This is pattern recognition of what is already happening. The 20% you lost since 2021 was not an accident. It was the opening phase, and if history is any guide, we are nowhere near the end. This pattern has played out before, in different nations, under different circumstances, with different currencies. The mechanics are always the same. The outcome is always the same. The only variable is how long citizens take to recognize what is being done to them, and by then, the transfer is usually complete. The transfer is usually complete before anyone names what happened. That is the lesson I kept encountering when I studied the most infamous currency collapse of the modern era: Germany, the Weimar Republic, the years between 1921 and 1923. I had heard about this period my entire life. Wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread, children playing with stacks of worthless banknotes. But I had never understood the mechanics. I assumed it was chaos from the start. Economic illiteracy. A broken nation making obvious mistakes. I was wrong about all of it. In 1914, the German mark traded at approximately 4.2 marks per United States dollar. This was a stable, respected currency. Germany was an industrial powerhouse. Its institutions were sophisticated. Its central bank was considered competent. 9 years later, in November 1923, the exchange rate reached 4.2 trillion marks per dollar. Not million, not billion, trillion. The same currency, the same nation, the same institutions. What happened in between was not random. It followed a pattern I now recognize in the structure of what surrounds us today. If German citizens in 1921 thought hyperinflation was impossible in an industrialized nation, what makes you certain it cannot happen here? The collapse began with debt. Germany lost World War I and signed the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. That treaty imposed reparations obligations that exceeded Germany's capacity to pay through taxation. The government faced a choice that should sound familiar: raise taxes to crushing levels, cut spending to the bone, or finance the gap by printing currency. They chose the third option. The Reichsbank began creating marks to cover government deficits. At first, the effects were tolerable. Prices rose. But gradually, citizens grumbled but adapted. The economy continued functioning. There was no single moment when alarms sounded. This is what disturbed me most when I studied the timeline. The early stages of hyperinflation do not feel like a crisis. They feel like inflation, annoying but manageable. The difference between regular inflation and hyperinflation is not magnitude at the start, it is trajectory. Regular inflation is a constant erosion. Hyperinflation is an exponential curve. It moves slowly at the bottom of the curve. Then it hits an inflection point. After that, it accelerates beyond any policy response. The Weimar collapse did not take decades. The terminal phase took approximately 24 months. 2 years from concerning to catastrophic. The mechanism behind this acceleration is confidence. Currency has no intrinsic value. It is paper or digits in a database. Its value comes entirely from the collective belief that it can be exchanged for goods and services tomorrow. When that belief holds, currency functions. When that belief cracks, the mathematics change instantly. People stop holding currency any longer than necessary. They spend it immediately before it loses more value. This behavior is rational at the individual level, but it creates a feedback loop at the system level. Velocity of money spikes, prices rise faster, confidence falls further. The cycle feeds itself. What would you do if prices started doubling every few weeks and your bank limited withdrawals? I have read firsthand accounts from Germans who lived through the collapse. What struck me was how many of them described the same phenomenon. They did not see it coming. Not because they were ignorant, because the early phases looked like something manageable. They had seen inflation before. They assumed this was more of the same. By the time they recognized the pattern had changed, their savings were already worthless. A lifetime of labor converted to paper that could not buy a loaf of bread. The recognition came too late. It always does. The triggering event in Germany was not a single catastrophe. It was a cascade of failing confidence. Reparations payments drained gold reserves. The French occupied the Ruhr industrial region in 1923. German workers went on strike. The government printed even more currency to pay them. Foreign creditors lost faith. Domestic citizens followed. The mark entered free fall. In the final months, prices doubled every few days, then every few hours. Shops changed prices multiple times per day. Workers demanded to be paid twice daily so they could spend their wages before they became worthless. This is what the terminal phase looks like. Not slow erosion, phase transition. I need to be precise here because this is where the pattern becomes uncomfortable. The conditions that preceded Weimar are not exotic. External debt obligations the government cannot service through taxation. Check. A central bank willing to monetize government deficits. Check. Political unwillingness to impose austerity or raise taxes sufficiently. Check. An initial period of moderate inflation that conditions citizens to accept rising prices as normal. Check. The ingredients are not secret. They are listed in every economic history textbook. The question is whether we recognize them when they appear in our own context. How much of your net worth is held in dollar-denominated assets right now? There is a concept I encountered that reframed how I think about currency stability. It is called the confidence threshold. Every fiat currency exists above a certain level of collective belief. As long as enough participants trust the currency, it functions. But that trust is not linear. It does not erode smoothly. It holds steady until it does not. Then it collapses rapidly. The transition from stable to unstable is not gradual. It is a phase shift. Like water turning to ice, the temperature drops slowly. Then, at exactly 32 degrees, the state changes instantly. Currency confidence works the same way. The threshold is invisible until you cross it. The German middle class was destroyed in those 24 months. Not the poor. The poor had little to lose, not the very wealthy. They held real assets: land, factories, gold. The middle class held savings, pensions, insurance policies, fixed income instruments, all denominated in marks, all wiped out. A generation of prudent savers discovered that their prudence was the trap. They had followed the rules, worked hard, saved diligently, put their faith in institutions. Those institutions converted their life's work into paper confetti. The wealth did not disappear. It transferred from those who held currency to those who held real assets and debt. I keep the question, or only after. That question kept me awake for longer than I want to admit, because the answer requires me to look at numbers I would rather not see. Numbers that suggest we are not at the beginning of this pattern. We are somewhere in the middle, maybe past the middle. I used to think this privilege was a permanent advantage, a structural feature that made America different, exempt from the patterns that destroyed other currencies. I no longer believe that. Reserve currency status is not a shield. It is a delay mechanism, and delay mechanisms do not prevent consequences. They compress them. The inflation we exported for 50 years does not vanish. It accumulates overseas in the form of dollar holdings. And when those holders lose confidence, when they begin reducing their dollar reserves, those dollars come home, all at once. If the institutions telling you inflation is under control are the same institutions that benefit from inflation, why would you believe them? Between 2023 and 2024, something structurally significant began happening. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, accelerated discussions about trade settlement in currencies other than the dollar. Bilateral agreements emerged. Currency swap lines expanded. These were not grandstanding gestures. These were technical arrangements with immediate economic effect. The percentage of global trade settled in dollars has been declining, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. Each agreement that bypasses the dollar is one less source of demand for dollars, one less buyer for the treasury bonds that fund our deficits. The numbers underneath this shift are more alarming than the headlines suggest. In 2024, the United States government spent over $1 trillion just on interest payments for the national debt. Not principal, not programs, just interest. That figure exceeded what the government spent on national defense. It exceeded what it spent on Medicare. The single largest budget item became servicing debt, and interest rates are still historically low compared to the 1980s. If rates rise further, the interest expense becomes unmanageable. If rates fall, inflation reignites. The trap I described earlier is not theoretical, it is operational, right now. Treasury auctions have become more volatile. There were multiple auctions in 2023 and 2024 where demand was weaker than expected. Yields spiked. The government had to pay more to attract buyers. This is the early signal of weakening confidence, not collapse, not crisis, just the first signs that the infinite bid is not infinite, that the assumption of endless demand for United States debt might be an assumption and nothing more. When I see these auction results, I do not see anomalies. I see the temperature dropping toward 32 degrees. The Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet from approximately $4 trillion in early 2020 to nearly $9 trillion by 2022. That is $5 trillion in new monetary base created in roughly 2 years. The stated purpose was to stabilize markets during a crisis. The effect was to double the size of the central bank's holdings. Those dollars entered the system. They chased assets. They chased goods. The 20% price increase you experienced was not a supply chain accident. It was the direct and predictable result of monetary expansion at a scale never before attempted in peacetime. When the history of this era is written, will it say that Americans saw the pattern and prepared, or that they trusted the same signals that failed every previous generation? Here is the mechanism they never explain in simple terms. Reserve currency status allowed the United States to run enormous trade deficits without immediate inflation. We imported goods, exported dollars. Those dollars sat in foreign central bank reserves. As long as they stayed there, they did not bid up prices domestically. But de-dollarization reverses this flow. When foreign holders reduce their dollar reserves, those dollars return to the United States. They come back without corresponding goods. The money supply increases domestically without increased production. This is the boomerang effect. The inflation we exported for half a century compressed into a much shorter time frame. I have tried to find a historical example of a reserve currency that transitioned peacefully to secondary status without major wealth destruction. I could not find one. The British pound lost reserve status over several decades in the 20th century. Britain experienced stagflation, financial crises, currency devaluation, and dramatic declines in living standards during that transition. And Britain's debt burden was smaller. Its currency decline was slower. The United States faces a faster transition with a larger debt load and a population unprepared for the consequences. The pattern suggests this will not be gentle. What exactly are you holding when you hold dollars? That question became unbearable once I understood the answer. I am holding a liability of the United States government, a promise to pay denominated in the same currency that government controls and creates. The government owes $36 trillion. It cannot pay that debt through taxation without triggering political collapse. It cannot cut spending enough to close the gap without dismantling foundational programs. It cannot raise interest rates high enough to attract infinite bond demand without bankrupting itself through interest expense. The only mathematically viable path is inflation. Controlled if possible, uncontrolled if necessary, but inflation nonetheless. This is the illusion I had to abandon. The dollar is not wealth. It is a claim on wealth. And that claim is issued by an institution that benefits when the claim loses value. Every dollar in your savings account is a promise from a debtor who is functionally insolvent. The debtor controls the printing press. The debtor controls the interest rate. The debtor controls the inflation measurement methodology. You are the creditor, and you have no enforcement mechanism. This is not a safe position. This is not stability. This is structural vulnerability disguised as normalcy. The point of no return is not a date on a calendar. It is a threshold of debt relative to economic output. When debt to GDP exceeds a certain level, the government can no longer service that debt at positive real interest rates. Real rates are nominal rates minus inflation. If the interest rate is 5% and inflation is 3%, the real rate is 2%. Positive real rates reward savers. Negative real rates punish them. Once debt crosses the threshold, positive real rates become unaffordable. The government must suppress rates below inflation. Financial repression becomes permanent. We cross that threshold. The debt to GDP ratio confirms it. The interest expense confirms it. The policy choices confirm it. I am not predicting a specific event on a specific date. I am recognizing a structural condition that has already formed. The question is not whether this leads to wealth destruction. History answers that. The question is what form the destruction takes and over what time frame. Rapid hyperinflation remains unlikely in the short term because of reserve currency inertia. Outright default is politically unthinkable. That leaves the third path, the slow grind, financial repression sustained over years, maybe decades, real interest rates held negative, savings eroded silently, purchasing power transferred from creditors to the debtor government, death by 1,000 cuts instead of one catastrophic blow. But slow grinds can accelerate, confidence curves can break. The gap between managed decline and uncontrolled collapse is thinner than policymakers admit. One failed auction, one geopolitical shock, one major creditor nation dumping treasury holdings. Any of these could be the triggering event that shifts the pattern from Weimar's early phase to Weimar's terminal phase. And we will not see it coming. We never do. Because the early phase and the terminal phase look identical until the moment they do not. You cannot save your way to safety in a currency that is designed to lose value. That is the cognitive lock, the realization that makes everything else collapse into clarity. The system does not reward your prudence. It requires your loss. The inflation is not a bug. It is the feature that makes the entire structure operational. Without your purchasing power decline, the government cannot manage its debt. Without financial repression, the math does not work. You are not a participant in this system. You are the input, the raw material, the source of the wealth transfer that keeps the mechanism running. Inflation is not an economic accident. It is a political technology. It transfers wealth from those who save to those who print. And in America, the printing has only just begun. You worked. You saved. You followed the rules. The rules were the trap. The currency was the weapon. And the target was always you.